He stopped loving her out loud, so she learned to love herself in silence. And when she finally walked into the same room he'd forbidden her from attending, she didn't come to be seen. She came to remind him who she'd always been. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The early morning light filtered through the cream curtains, casting a soft golden hue across the bedroom. The room was quiet, too quiet. Evelyn turned slightly on the bed, her eyes landing on the other side where Richard used to sleep close, his arm draped protectively over her waist. That morning, as on most mornings now, the space beside her was empty, cold, and untouched. She listened faintly to the sound of running water from the shower. Richard was getting ready for work, just as he always did, structured, efficient, detached. It wasn't always this way. She remembered when he used to wake her with gentle kisses, whispering something sweet before he rushed off. But those mornings had faded into memories, and now silence had replaced warmth. Evelyn sat up slowly, her silk nightgown sliding down her shoulder. She caught her reflection in the mirror, her dark hair slightly tousled, her eyes tired. She ran a hand through her hair and sighed. When did we stop looking at each other like we used to? Richard emerged from the bathroom in his usual dark suit, adjusting his tie in front of the dresser. "Morning," he said absently, not meeting her eyes. "Good morning," she replied softly, forcing a smile. He nodded, reached for his watch, and checked the time on his phone. "I've got an early meeting. Don't wait up for me tonight. It might run late." There was a time those words would have disappointed her deeply. Now she had learned to mask the ache. "All right," she said simply, though her heart sank a little further. As he headed toward the door, she called after him. "Richard." He paused, hand on the knob. "Yes." "Did you sleep well?" she asked, hoping to start even the smallest conversation. He looked puzzled by the question. "Yeah." "Why?" She forced another small smile. "Just asking." "Okay," he murmured, glancing at his watch again. "See you tonight." And with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne, and an echo of emptiness that seemed to linger longer each day. Evelyn sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the quietness of her home. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, its rhythm matching the dull heaviness in her chest. She rose slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the morning street below. People were rushing off to work, couples holding hands, neighbors waving to each other. The world looked so full of life, yet her own house felt lifeless. When she made her way to the kitchen, she poured herself a cup of coffee and another for Richard out of habit. She stood staring at his untouched mug for a long moment before setting it aside. It was a small, silly ritual, but it reminded her of when he used to come up behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and steal the first sip from her cup. That used to be their thing. Now, even the smell of coffee couldn't warm her. She sat at the dining table, scrolling through her phone absently. Her social feed was filled with anniversary photos, vacation selfies, and laughing couples. She couldn't help but wonder, what did we do wrong? When did we stop being in love? Her thoughts were interrupted by a buzz from her phone, a text from Richard. For a moment, her heart lifted until she read it. "Don't forget to call the plumber today. There's a leak in the upstairs bathroom. Thanks." That was it. No love you, no emoji, not even her name. Just a reminder. Evelyn placed the phone face down on the table and took a deep breath. "You're overthinking again," she whispered to herself. "He's just busy. Things will get better." But deep inside, a quiet voice disagreed. Later that evening, she set the table for two anyway, lighting the candles she knew he liked, preparing his favorite meal, hoping maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. But as the hours passed, the food grew cold and her heart heavier. The clock struck 10 before she finally gave up and packed away the dishes. When she heard the sound of the garage door opening, she quickly smoothed her hair and tried to look cheerful. Richard entered, exhaustion on his face. "Hey," she greeted softly. How was work? Busy, he muttered, loosening his tie. I'm starving. Did you eat already? I waited for you. He glanced at the clock, guilt flickering briefly across his face before vanishing. You shouldn't have. You know how unpredictable things get. She smiled faintly. I just thought we could have dinner together again. Like we used to. He didn't respond. Instead, he heated his plate in the microwave and stood by the counter eating silently. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound that filled the kitchen. Evelyn sat opposite him, watching him eat in silence. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say. How she missed him, how distant he'd become. But every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck in her throat. After dinner, he mumbled something about checking emails and retreated to his study. She sat alone, staring at his half-empty glass of wine, feeling more like a ghost in her own marriage than a wife. Later that night, she slipped into bed beside him. The light from his phone glowed faintly as he scrolled through messages, his back turned to her. Evelyn lay there quietly, eyes open, heart aching. She wanted to reach out and touch his arm, to remind him she was still there, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered softly into the darkness. I miss us. He didn't hear her. Or maybe he did and chose silence. Either way, the distance between them was no longer just emotional. It was a cold, undeniable reality that now lived between their hearts. The following weeks unfolded like a gray stretch of sky, quiet, monotonous, and painfully predictable. Evelyn moved through the days as if on autopilot, preparing breakfast, packing Richard's lunch, managing her online interior decor business, keeping the house in perfect order. Everything looked flawless from the outside, yet inside, she felt herself fading into the background of her own life. It wasn't that Richard had become cruel. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't angry. He was simply absent, emotionally vacant. His mind seemed permanently tethered to his phone, his meetings, his endless string of business calls. At first, Evelyn tried to make excuses for him. He's stressed, she told herself. He's got too much on his plate. But as the days turned into weeks, the excuses started to sound like lies she told to soothe her own heart. One morning, she was arranging fresh lilies on the dining table when Richard came down the stairs, already dressed in his navy suit, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, move the meeting to 4, he said briskly. And tell Mr. Weller I'll send the report before noon. Evelyn stood there, smiling, waiting for him to end the call so she could greet him properly. But as soon as he hung up, he just gave her a distracted nod and reached for his car keys. Breakfast's ready, she said hopefully, gesturing toward the steaming plates on the table. Ah, can't today. I'll grab a coffee on the way, he said, sliding on his watch. Big morning ahead. She tried to hide the disappointment in her voice. At least have a bite, Richard. You skipped dinner last night, too. He gave a quick half-smile, the kind people give when they don't really mean it. You're sweet, Eve, but I'll be fine. Promise. He leaned forward as if to kiss her cheek, but his phone buzzed again, and instead of finishing the gesture, he stepped aside to answer. Yeah, I'm on my way, he said, walking out the door. The sound of the closing door echoed through the house like a final note of rejection. Evelyn stood still for a long moment, her hand still hovering near the chair where he should have sat. When she finally sat down, the eggs on her plate had already gone cold. Later that day, she met her friend Clara at a cafe downtown. Clara was the kind of woman whose laughter filled a room, effortlessly charming and carefree. Evelyn envied that about her. You look tired, Eve, Clara said as they settled into a corner booth. Is everything okay? Evelyn stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. I'm fine. Just busy. Clara gave her a knowing look. Busy or unhappy? Evelyn hesitated. She had promised herself not to complain. People always assumed that a beautiful woman with a successful husband had nothing to be sad about. But her silence must have said enough because Clara reached across the table and touched her hand gently. Talk to me, she said softly. Evelyn looked down, blinking back the sting in her eyes. It's like I don't exist anymore. Richard's there, but he's not there. He doesn't see me. I talk, and it's like my words just bounce off the walls. Have you told him how you feel? I tried. He says everything's fine, that I'm overthinking things. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just not interesting anymore. Don't say that, Clara said firmly. You're one of the most graceful women I know. If he can't see that, that's his blindness, not your flaw. Evelyn smiled faintly, appreciating her friend's words even though they didn't ease the ache. I just want my husband back. The one who used to hold my hand for no reason. Who'd send me silly texts in the middle of meetings. I don't know where he went, or if he's ever coming back. Clara sighed, squeezing her hand. Sometimes men forget what they have until they almost lose it. Just don't lose yourself while waiting for him to notice. Evelyn nodded quietly, though inside, she wasn't sure she had much of herself left to hold on to. That evening, she returned home early and decided to do something special. She wore a soft cream dress Richard once said made her look like sunrise, and prepared his favorite dinner, garlic butter salmon, roasted potatoes, and wine. She dimmed the lights, lit candles, and set the table for two, her heart fluttering with a mix of nervousness and hope. When Richard came in around 9:30, he looked exhausted, shoulders sagging under the weight of another long day. He loosened his tie and sighed heavily. Something smells good, he said distractedly, dropping his briefcase near the couch. I made dinner, she said with a shy smile. Thought we could eat together. He looked at the table, at the flickering candles and carefully plated meal, and for a brief second, guilt flashed across his face. But then he exhaled. Eve, I really appreciate this, but I already grabbed something with the team. We had a late meeting. Her smile faltered. Oh, I see. I'm sorry, he said quickly. You know how unpredictable work can be. She nodded, though her throat felt tight. Of course. Work first. He reached out to touch her shoulder but hesitated, as if the gesture required too much effort. You understand, right? Yeah, she whispered. I understand. He gave a tired smile and headed upstairs to shower, leaving her standing by the table with the candles still flickering and the food untouched. After he went to bed, Evelyn sat alone in the dimly lit dining room, staring at the soft dance of the candle flames. The silence around her felt heavy, suffocating. The wine glass she'd poured for herself sat half empty, its reflection shimmering in the candlelight like liquid sadness. She picked up her phone, opened the photo album, and scrolled through old pictures. Richard holding her on a beach in Bali, the two of them laughing over pancakes on their first anniversary, his hand brushing her cheek under a string of fairy lights. Those moments felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Her eyes welled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, refusing to let them fall. You're still here, she whispered to herself. You're still the same woman. You just need to find her again. And yet, deep inside, she feared she was becoming invisible, not just to Richard, but to herself. The morning sunlight filtered into the house, glinting off the polished marble floors as Evelyn tidied Richard's study. She rarely came in here anymore. It was his space, full of papers, files, and the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in the air. She moved carefully, straightening a stack of documents and dusting the edges of picture frames. Most of them were business-related awards and photographs of corporate dinners. Faces smiling stiffly in formal suits, women in evening gowns, all pretending to be happy in a world where charm was a mask. As she reached for a few envelopes scattered on the desk, one in particular caught her attention. It was made of heavy cream paper, sealed with a gold-embossed crest that shimmered faintly when it caught the light. Curious, she turned it over and read the inscription. The annual Delacroix Foundation Gala, an evening of elegance and philanthropy. She opened it gently and scanned the words. It was one of those grand events that made it to the society pages, an elite gathering of business moguls, politicians, and socialites. Black tie, champagne fountains, classical music, the kind of event where she and Richard used to shine together. Her lips curved into a hopeful smile. Maybe this could be our night. When Richard came home that evening, she waited until he'd set down his briefcase before mentioning it. You got an invitation to the Delacroix Gala, she said casually, holding up the envelope. I saw it in your study. He looked up briefly, nodding. "Oh, right. Yeah, it's next Friday. Big networking event. I'll have to make an appearance." Evelyn hesitated before stepping closer. "That sounds wonderful. I'd love to go with you. We haven't been out together in ages." For a moment, he looked genuinely caught off guard. "You want to come?" "Of course," she said, her voice soft but filled with hope. "It's been so long since we dressed up, went out, had fun together. Remember last year's gala? We danced for hours." Richard's gaze shifted, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I remember." He rubbed the back of his neck, sighing. "It's just that this one's going to be different. It's a business thing this time. Lots of networking, formal speeches. You'll be bored out of your mind." Her heart dropped, but she tried to keep her tone light. "I don't mind. I'd still like to go. I miss being by your side." He gave a small, apologetic smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Evelyn, it's really not the kind of event for company. I need to focus, make impressions. You know how these things are." She stared at him, the air between them thick with unspoken feelings. "Richard," she said quietly, "you don't have to make excuses. If you don't want me there, just say so." His eyes flickered with guilt. "That's not it," he said quickly. "You're reading too much into this. I just think it'll be dull for you, that's all." She nodded slowly, forcing a small smile even as a lump formed in her throat. "Of course. You're probably right. Thank you for understanding," he said with relief, leaning forward to kiss her forehead before heading upstairs. The kiss felt hollow, an act of habit, not affection. When she heard the sound of his footsteps fade, Evelyn sank onto the couch. The golden invitation still lay on the coffee table, gleaming under the warm light. It mocked her silently. For a long moment, she just sat there staring at it. Then she whispered, "He doesn't want to be seen with me anymore." That night, she couldn't sleep. The clock on her nightstand ticked softly, each second stretching endlessly. She turned to look at Richard, his back facing her, his breathing slow and steady. She thought about the way he used to look at her, eyes full of admiration and pride whenever they walked into a room together. She thought about how, during their early years, he would boast to his friends about how lucky he was to have her. Now he barely looked her way. She rolled over, clutching the edge of the blanket, her heart aching in a quiet, suffocating way that no tears could express. The next morning, she decided not to mention the gala again. She poured his coffee, asked about his schedule, and smiled like everything was fine. He left for work in his usual rush, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before disappearing out the door. As the garage door closed, Evelyn stood there in the silence of their perfect house, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the space where conversation used to live. Her gaze drifted toward the invitation on the counter. The sunlight hit the gold lettering again, making it gleam like something alive. That was when a quiet thought stirred inside her, faint but powerful. If he doesn't want me there, I'll go anyway. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know what she would wear or how she would even walk into that event without him by her side. But something inside her had shifted. For months, she had been waiting for him to see her, to notice her, to make her feel visible again. But now she decided, if he won't see me, everyone else will. Later that day, she sat at her vanity, her reflection staring back at her with quiet determination. She reached for her phone and began scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Her favorite stylist, Lucia. "Lucia," she said when the line connected. "I need a favor. I have an event next Friday, and I want a dress that will make people stop talking when I walk in." Lucia laughed lightly. "Now that's the Evelyn I remember. Elegant and unstoppable. What kind of statement do we want to make?" Evelyn looked at her reflection again, the woman with tired eyes, faded confidence, and a heart full of longing. Then, slowly, a small, daring smile curved her lips. "The kind," she said, "that reminds everyone, including my husband, exactly who I am." The morning after the decision felt different, quieter, lighter, though nothing had changed in the house itself. The same polished floors, the same framed photographs of happier times, the same untouched breakfast plate across from hers. Yet inside Evelyn, something stirred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was resolve. For months, she had been waiting for Richard to bring her back into his world, to choose her, to reach for her, to remind her that she still mattered. But that waiting had turned her into a ghost. And ghosts were invisible. Now she was done waiting. Evelyn spent the next few days in silence. Not the empty, aching silence of loneliness, but a quiet filled with thought. She started her mornings earlier, taking long walks through the neighborhood as dawn broke over the horizon. The world was peaceful at that hour, painted in soft gold and lavender. For the first time in a long while, she noticed the beauty of it, the chirping of distant birds, the smell of dew on the grass, the cool air brushing against her skin. It was as if the world was whispering to her, "Wake up. You're still here." She began eating better, not because she wanted to impress Richard, but because she wanted to feel alive again. She replaced her usual rushed toast and coffee with yogurt, fruits, and herbal tea. She started reading the novels she'd bought months ago but never opened. At night, she played soft music instead of drowning in silence. Each small act became a quiet rebellion, a step back toward herself. One afternoon, she walked into her closet and stared at the row of clothes hanging neatly in order. Pristine, elegant, but lifeless. Most of them had been chosen with Richard in mind. The subtle dresses he liked, the neutral shades he said looked classy. She reached out, fingers brushing over the fabric, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had worn something for herself. Her phone buzzed. It was Lucia. "Evelyn, darling, I've been thinking about your request. Come in tomorrow. I have just the thing for you." A slow smile spread across Evelyn's lips. Tomorrow it is. Lucia's boutique was nestled in the heart of the city, a sanctuary of satin and silk. The moment Evelyn walked in, the scent of perfume and soft jazz music enveloped her. Lucia, tall and vibrant with a flair for the dramatic, rushed over and pulled her into a hug. "There she is," Lucia said, stepping back to look her up and down. "You look better already. There's color in your cheeks again." Evelyn laughed softly. "I think I'm remembering how to breathe." "Good. Then let's make sure the world remembers how to stare." Lucia's eyes sparkled as she gestured toward a rack of dresses. "I picked out a few options, but I think I know exactly what you need." She led Evelyn to a mirror-lined fitting room and handed her a short, sleek, black cocktail dress. It was simple yet magnetic, the kind of dress that whispered power without shouting it. The neckline was elegant, the fit precise, hugging her figure in a way that was both tasteful and bold. Evelyn slipped into it and turned toward the mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her reflection looked poised, graceful, alive. Lucia's lips curved into a proud smile. There she is, the woman he forgot to see. Evelyn swallowed hard, emotion rising in her chest. I almost forgot she existed too. Lucia came closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then don't ever let her disappear again. Evelyn nodded, meeting her own gaze in the mirror. For the first time in months, her reflection didn't look like a stranger. That night, after returning home, Evelyn stood in front of her vanity. She wiped away her minimal makeup and examined her bare face. The fine lines near her eyes, the faint shadows of exhaustion, she had once seen them as flaws. Now she saw stories. Proof that she had loved deeply, lived fully, and endured quietly. She picked up her brush, slowly combing through her dark hair, letting it fall in soft waves. Each stroke felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in the blur of disappointment. When Richard came home that evening, she was in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a book in her hands. She looked serene. He glanced at her briefly before heading to the kitchen. "You're home early," she said, not looking up from her book. "Yeah, meeting got canceled," he replied, opening the fridge. "Want to order dinner?" "I already ate." Her tone was calm, almost indifferent. Richard paused, surprised. "Oh, okay." For the first time, she didn't rush to fill the silence between them. She simply turned a page, her focus still on her book. Something in her stillness unsettled him. She wasn't pleading, wasn't asking questions, wasn't trying to engage him. It was as if the emotional thread that had tied her to his moods had quietly snapped. "Everything okay?" he asked after a moment. Evelyn finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a quiet smile. "Everything's fine, Richard. I'm just learning to take care of myself again." He nodded awkwardly, clearly unsure what to say. "That's good." "Yes," she said softly, returning to her book. "It really is." Over the next few days, Evelyn moved differently. She carried herself with ease, her laughter lighter, her steps slower but confident. When she went out for coffee, she dressed beautifully, not extravagantly, just enough to feel radiant. The barista noticed. The woman at the bookstore complimented her earrings. People looked at her again, but this time, she didn't need their approval. She looked at herself differently, too. She started posting pictures again, sunlit selfies, her morning walks, the little things that brought her joy. Clara called her one afternoon, half laughing, half shocked. "Who is this glowing goddess on my feed?" Evelyn chuckled. "Just someone who finally remembered who she was." The week of the gala approached quickly. Richard didn't bring it up again, and neither did she. He assumed she'd forgotten, or accepted his decision. He couldn't have been more wrong. On the eve of the event, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror wearing the silver dress Lucia had tailored to perfection. The fabric shimmered faintly under the soft light, tracing every curve like it was made just for her. Her hair fell in waves, her eyes accentuated by a touch of smoky shadow. A ruby necklace, one Richard had gifted her years ago but she'd never worn, glowed against her skin. She stared at herself for a long moment, then smiled. The woman in the mirror wasn't a wife waiting to be chosen. She was her own answer. As she sprayed a hint of perfume on her wrist, she whispered to her reflection, "Tomorrow you walk in not for him, but for you." The night of the gala arrived dressed in its own kind of magic, one that shimmered in the air like champagne bubbles and whispered promises of secrets, envy, and admiration. The city lights glittered below as Evelyn stood in front of her mirror one last time. Her heart beat steadily, not from nervousness but anticipation. The woman who gazed back at her was no longer the shadow of someone waiting to be noticed. Her silver short dress fit like a secret she'd been waiting to reveal. It hugged her body just right, elegant, sophisticated, and dangerously magnetic. Her hair cascaded in soft waves down her shoulders, her makeup flawless but understated, drawing attention to her. A faint trace of red lipstick completed the look, bold, daring, unapologetic. She picked up her clutch and paused at the dresser, where a framed wedding photo of her and Richard sat. In it, he was looking at her as if she were the only woman in the world. She smiled faintly, a bittersweet curve of the lips, and whispered, "Let's see if you still remember how that feels." The ballroom at the Delacroix Foundation Gala was everything one would expect of the city's most prestigious social event. Grand chandeliers glittering like frozen fireworks, soft classical music floating through the air, waiters weaving gracefully between clusters of guests carrying trays of golden champagne. Men in tailored tuxedos spoke in measured tones about mergers and markets. Women in gowns that whispered luxury laughed politely, their diamonds catching the light like tiny stars. Richard moved among them with practiced ease. His handshake was firm, his smile smooth. He talked business, strategy, expansion, all while nursing a glass of scotch. On the surface, he was the perfect image of composure. Inside, however, something unsettled tugged at him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt off balance, restless. He had been thinking of Evelyn all day. When he'd left the house earlier that evening, she was already asleep, or so he thought. He hadn't told her he'd be late. He hadn't even thought to. But as he stood surrounded by flashing smiles and hollow compliments, he found himself wishing she were there beside him. It had been so long since he'd seen her laugh freely, since he'd felt her hand slip into his. The memory stung. He shook it off with a practiced chuckle as one of his business associates, Daniel, clapped him on the shoulder. "Richard, my man, your company's making waves again this quarter. Must feel good being the golden boy of the year." Richard smiled faintly, trying to keep up with expectations. Daniel grinned. "And where's your beautiful wife tonight?" "Evelyn, right? She always lights up these events." The question hit harder than Richard expected. He cleared his throat. She decided not to come. Busy week, you know. Pity, Daniel said, taking a sip of his drink. She has a presence. People notice when she walks in. Richard forced a polite laugh, but something tightened in his chest. He excused himself and moved toward the bar. And then, the hum of the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a collective pause, a faint ripple of attention that spread through the crowd. Conversations faltered, laughter softened. Heads turned toward the entrance. Richard followed their gaze, and his heart nearly stopped. She stood in the doorway like a vision sculpted from moonlight and fire. Evelyn. Every eye in the room seemed drawn to her as she stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her dress glimmered with each movement, subtle yet irresistible. The soft light caught the contours of her face, serene, poised, breathtaking. For a heartbeat, even the music seemed to hush. Men turned their heads. Women glanced at one another with a mixture of admiration and envy. And Richard, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He'd seen that dress before, or one like it, but never had it looked so alive. Never had she looked so alive. She wasn't the woman who waited for his attention. She wasn't the wife who lingered by the window wondering if he'd come home early. No, the woman who just walked in commanded the room, effortlessly. He watched, frozen, as a few men approached her immediately, one offering her a drink, another complimenting her appearance. Evelyn smiled politely, her laughter soft and controlled. There was no arrogance in her, only quiet confidence. For a long moment, Richard simply observed, guilt and awe swirling within him. She hadn't come to embarrass him. She hadn't even come for him. She came for herself, and that realization shook him. Daniel, standing nearby, let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Isn't that? Yes, Richard interrupted, his jaw tightening. That's my wife. Daniel chuckled. She's making quite an entrance. Richard said nothing. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Evelyn moved gracefully through the room, exchanging greetings, smiling, occasionally touching a hand lightly on an arm in conversation. She looked like she belonged, more than anyone there. And yet, she didn't even glance his way. When another man, younger, confident, impeccably dressed, stepped up beside her and offered her a glass of champagne, Richard felt a sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Jealousy. He watched the man lean closer, saying something that made Evelyn laugh. Her laughter, the sound he'd once been addicted to, now floated through the air, directed at someone else. It was unbearable. He set his glass down hard enough to make the bartender glance up. Without realizing it, Richard's steps had already begun moving toward her. Evelyn noticed him only when he was a few feet away. The look on his face, shock mingled with confusion, then something deeper, was almost satisfying. Evelyn, he said, his voice low but intense. She turned toward him with perfect composure, her smile polite. Richard, I didn't expect to see you here. His eyes flickered. You knew I'd be here. Yes, she replied simply. And you knew I wanted to come. For a moment, neither spoke. The man beside her, clearly sensing the tension, excused himself with a polite nod. Richard took a step closer, lowering his voice. You look, he trailed off, searching for words. You look incredible. Thank you. Her tone was calm, detached. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? He asked. She tilted her head slightly. I thought you said it wasn't an event for company. I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable. His jaw tightened. Evelyn, that's not. Before he could finish, another group of guests approached, greeting her warmly. Evelyn smiled, graciously shaking hands, engaging in conversation as if he weren't even there. The sight of her shining in her element, radiant, self-assured, made something in him crack. When the crowd shifted again, he reached out, his hand finding her arm gently but firmly. Can we talk? Please. Evelyn glanced at his hand, then up at him. Now. Yes. Before I lose my mind watching every man here look at you like. Like what? She asked softly. He swallowed hard. Like I used to. Her expression didn't change. Then maybe you shouldn't have stopped. The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap. For the first time in months, he saw himself clearly. The neglect, the coldness, the way he'd let routine and pride erode what they once had. And standing before him now was the proof of everything he'd risked losing. The woman he'd once promised to protect and cherish, now a stranger who didn't need him to feel whole. As the music swelled, Richard felt a surge of desperation. He leaned closer, his voice raw with honesty. "Evelyn, I was wrong. About everything. I don't even know why I pushed you away. But seeing you tonight, God, I can't stand the thought of anyone else near you." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes calm, unreadable. "I didn't come here to make you jealous, Richard. I came here to remember who I am." He nodded slowly, guilt and admiration flickering in his eyes. "And you did. You reminded me too." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two people surrounded by music, light, and laughter, yet caught in their own private storm. Then Evelyn stepped back, her voice gentle but firm. "If you really mean what you're saying, prove it when there isn't a room full of people watching. Not tonight." And with that, she turned gracefully and walked away, her perfume lingering in the air like a promise and a warning all at once. Richard watched her go, his heart pounding with regret and awakening. For the first time in a long while, he realized just how close he'd come to losing her, and how much he still loved her. The night air outside the ballroom was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Richard stood on the steps of the Delacroix Foundation Hall long after the last guests had drifted away, watching the city lights blur through his tired eyes. Inside, the music had faded. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, all gone. Yet Evelyn's voice still echoed in his head, calm and sharp as glass. "If you really mean what you're saying, prove it when there isn't a room full of people watching. Not tonight." He had watched her walk away from him, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with the grace of a woman who finally knew her worth. That was what cut him deepest. She hadn't stormed out, she hadn't shouted. She'd simply left him there, standing in the middle of his own regrets. He loosened his tie, his breath fogging slightly in the cool air. For months, he had convinced himself that his distance from her was logical, necessary, that work, deadlines, ambition all justified the void he'd built between them. But tonight had stripped away every illusion. When he'd seen her under those chandeliers, glowing like something divine, every careless word, every ignored moment, every cold shoulder replayed in brutal clarity. He had been blind. And now, for the first time, he truly saw her. He arrived home past midnight. The house was dark except for the faint golden light spilling from the kitchen. Evelyn's purse sat neatly on the counter, her shoes beside it. She was home, but the air carried that soft stillness that comes after a storm. Richard hesitated in the doorway of their bedroom. Evelyn was already in bed, lying on her side with her back to him, the moonlight touching her bare shoulder. She looked peaceful, but he could tell she wasn't asleep. The quiet rhythm of her breathing was too measured. He stood there for a moment, uncertain. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to tell her how she had changed the entire trajectory of his heart in one evening. But his throat tightened. Words, the very thing he used so easily in boardrooms, failed him completely now. He moved closer and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly, and she stirred, her voice soft. "Did you have a good evening?" It was polite, distant, like she was asking about the weather. He swallowed hard. "It would have been better if you hadn't walked away." She turned slightly, meeting his gaze in the dim light. "You seemed busy. I didn't want to interrupt." "Evelyn," he reached out, hesitating before his hand brushed her arm. Her skin was warm, familiar, but she didn't pull away. She just looked at him, calm, composed. "I meant what I said," she continued. "I didn't come to that party for you, Richard. I went because I needed to remember who I was before I started waiting for you to look at me again." Her voice trembled just slightly on that last sentence, and he felt it like a dagger. "I know," he said quietly, "and you were right to. I don't even know when I stopped seeing you. When I stopped trying." Evelyn sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her. "You didn't just stop seeing me, Richard. You stopped talking to me, touching me, wanting me. I thought it was me. I thought maybe I wasn't enough anymore." His eyes stung. "Don't say that. You were never the problem. She gave a sad, weary smile. Then what was? He exhaled, his voice raw. I don't know. Maybe I got lost in chasing success. Maybe I thought love would just stay on autopilot. But tonight, watching you walk into that room, I realized how far I've let you drift away, and how close I am to losing everything that ever mattered. There was a long silence between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. It sat heavy, raw, but real. Then Evelyn looked away, her voice softer. You can't fix months of silence with one night of jealousy, Richard. I know, he said, his tone steady now, stripped of defense. I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that I still love you. That I always did, even when I was too blind to act like it. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then finally she said, prove it, but not with words. Words don't mean much anymore. Richard nodded slowly. Then I'll start with actions. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. He didn't squeeze it, didn't try to make her feel something she wasn't ready to. He just held it, quietly, like a man trying to relearn the art of gentleness. They stayed like that for a while, the silence between them no longer cold, but heavy with the possibility of healing. The next morning, Evelyn woke to the faint smell of coffee drifting into the bedroom, something that hadn't happened in months. She blinked against the morning light and found Richard standing at the doorway, holding a tray. Breakfast, he said awkwardly, almost shyly. I wasn't sure how you take your coffee anymore, so I made 2 versions. One with sugar, one without. She sat up slowly, watching him. His hair was slightly disheveled, his tie undone. Not the polished executive she'd gotten used to, but the man she'd once fallen in love with. A small smile touched her lips. You remembered the toast? He smiled faintly. Burnt edges, just the way you like it. She chuckled softly. You actually listened to that? I used to, he admitted quietly. I stopped somewhere along the way. I won't again. Evelyn looked at the tray, at the small, imperfect breakfast he'd clearly made himself, and something inside her shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. As he placed the tray on her lap, their hands brushed, and for the first time in a long time, there wasn't discomfort, just familiarity. Thank you, she said softly. He met her gaze. No, Evelyn. Thank you. For not giving up on me before I even realized what I was losing. That evening, when the day had quieted, Richard found himself standing in the backyard, watching the sunset. Evelyn joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea. They stood side by side, silent at first, the warm hues of dusk bathing the garden in amber light. I used to love this time of day, she said finally. We used to come out here just to watch the sky change. I know, he murmured. I stopped coming because I thought I didn't have time. Turns out, I was just afraid of slowing down long enough to realize what I'd broken. Evelyn glanced at him, then out at the fading light. You don't get to fix everything overnight. He nodded. I know, but I'm not leaving this time, not emotionally, not physically. You deserve better than that. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt the walls around her heart soften. She didn't reach for him, but she didn't step away either. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, she whispered, almost to herself, maybe this time we can start learning each other again. Richard looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the woman he'd married, but the woman he'd nearly lost. I'd like that, he said quietly. More than anything. And as the sky darkened above them, for the first time in what felt like forever, they stood together, not as husband and wife bound by habit, but as 2 souls who finally saw each other again. The days that followed were quiet but different. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of before. This was a gentler kind of quiet. The kind that allowed things to breathe again. It began with small gestures. Richard started coming home earlier. Not with flowers or grand declarations, but with his presence. Sometimes he'd simply sit at the kitchen counter while Evelyn cooked, telling her about his day. At first, she listened politely, her responses measured. But slowly, the stiffness began to melt. He noticed little things again. The way she hummed softly when she was focused, the tiny crease between her brows when she read, the way her laughter came like sunlight when she forgot to guard herself. One evening, while she was reading on the couch, he placed a cup of tea beside her without saying a word. She looked up, surprised. "You remembered how I take it?" she asked. "2 spoons of honey," he said, smiling faintly. "I never really forgot. I just stopped paying attention." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression softening, then nodded. "Thank you." That night, when she went to bed, she found a handwritten note on her pillow. "I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I'm just asking for a chance to love you properly again, the way you deserve. R." She held the note to her chest for a long moment before placing it on her nightstand. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without tears. Weeks passed. Their home began to feel warm again. Laughter returned, not forced or uncertain, but real. They went for morning walks together, like they used to. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, but the silence felt easy shared. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn was watering the plants in the garden when Richard stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee. The air smelled of wet soil and jasmine. "You've brought these back to life," he said, nodding toward the row of flowers that had started blooming again. Evelyn smiled. They just needed a little attention. And time. He watched her, understanding the quiet message hidden in her words. "So did we," he murmured. She glanced up at him, meeting his eyes for a long moment. He looked different now, softer somehow. The arrogance had faded, replaced by something gentler, humbler. He set the mugs on the patio table and took a slow breath. "Can I take you somewhere tonight?" She raised a brow. "Somewhere." He smiled, a touch nervous. "You'll see." That evening, Richard drove them to a small restaurant by the lake, a place they hadn't been to in years. It wasn't fancy like the events they used to attend, but it was intimate. Wooden beams, fairy lights strung across the patio, the faint sound of water lapping against the dock. As they sat down, Evelyn looked around, smiling softly. "You remembered this place." "Of course I did," he said quietly. "This is where I proposed to you." Her gaze softened. "You used to be so nervous that night." He chuckled. "I was terrified you'd say no." "I almost did," she teased, her tone light. He laughed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it was easy, natural. They talked over dinner, not about business, not about the past, but about simple things. Memories. Dreams. The people they used to be. It felt like peeling back the layers of time to find something pure still alive beneath it all. After dessert, he stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me?" Evelyn blinked, smiling in surprise. "There's no music." He gestured toward the speakers near the bar. "There is now." A soft melody began to play, the same song they had danced to at their wedding. The moment it began, Evelyn's heart clenched. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. As they moved slowly under the fairy lights, the world around them seemed to fade. Richard held her gently, not tightly, just enough to say, "I'm here, and I won't let you go again." "I missed this," she whispered against his shoulder. "So did I," he murmured. "I didn't realize how empty life felt until I lost your laughter." Evelyn looked up at him. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I'm just trying to make sure I never lose it again." For a moment, they simply swayed, her cheek resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady and warm. And in that quiet rhythm, something inside her softened completely. The walls she'd built began to crumble, not because of his words, but because of the consistency of his actions, the sincerity in his eyes. She pulled back just slightly, her gaze locking on his. "I forgive you," she said softly. "Not because I forgot what you did, but because I see how hard you're trying to make it right." His breath hitched. "Evelyn." Before he could speak, she placed her hand on his cheek. "Just promise me one thing. Don't stop seeing me. Don't let us fade again." He covered her hand with his voice trembling. "Never again. You have my word." Later that night, they returned home, still wrapped in the quiet glow of their rediscovered connection. The house felt different, alive. Richard took her hand as they walked through the doorway, and for once, he didn't let go. In the living room, he paused, glancing toward the record player. Dance with me again? Evelyn laughed softly. We already danced. Once isn't enough. He put on a slow, vintage tune, and they began to move again, barefoot this time, surrounded by the dim warmth of their own home. The flicker of candlelight danced across their faces. As they swayed, Evelyn looked up at him and whispered, "We found it again, didn't we?" Richard smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he said gently. "We built it again." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in a long, long while, it felt like home. Days turned into weeks, and their rhythm continued to rebuild itself. Not perfectly, not without effort, but beautifully imperfect. They learned to laugh again, to talk honestly, to make space for each other. The spark that had once died quietly now burned with a deeper, steadier flame, not wild, but warm and constant. One evening, while sitting on the porch, Evelyn watched the sun dip below the horizon. Richard handed her a cup of tea, their fingers brushing. She smiled softly. "It's strange. We almost lost everything." He nodded. "Sometimes it takes losing sight of the light to remember how to reach for it." She turned to him, eyes soft and full of peace. "And we did." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yes, we did." The wind rustled the garden leaves, carrying the scent of jasmine and something else, something new yet familiar. Love rekindled. That night, as they lay together in the quiet dark, Evelyn whispered, "Richard, thank you for finding me again." He smiled in the darkness, his hand finding hers. "No," he murmured. "Thank you for never giving up, even when I didn't deserve you." And there, in the soft silence between them, where love had once faded, a gentle spark glowed once more, burning steady and bright. Not as it had before, but stronger, real, enduring.
Thank you so much for listening to this story at Folklore Chronicles-k Stories. And please, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, kindly click on the subscribe button, turn on the notification so when I post more stories like this, you'll be the first to get them. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate your support and I do not take it for granted at all. Until I see you in my next video. Bye.